Imagine for a moment you are born a living god. Your titles are so numerous they exhaust the breath of the scribes who recite them. The strong bull, perfect of births, lord of the two lands, lord of diadems, king of Upper and Lower Egypt. Your name itself, Tutankhamun, means living image of Amun, the king of the gods. You are the nexus between the divine and the mortal, the absolute center of the most powerful civilization on earth. Now, imagine you cannot walk without a cane. Imagine that every step sends a shock of pain through a twisted, deformed foot. Imagine your mouth is malformed, a cleft in your palate making speech difficult and eating a clumsy, frustrating ordeal. Your spine is curved, your bones are brittle, and your blood is a thin, feverish soup teeming with parasites that leave you weak and perpetually ill. You are a god trapped in a cage of broken flesh, a divine ruler whose mortal body is a testament not to perfection, but to a grotesque, systemic failure. This was the reality for the boy king, Tutankhamun. His famous golden mask projects an image of serene, eternal power, but the body beneath the gold tells a far more horrific story. What secret, what unforgivable sin against nature was so deeply embedded in the fabric of Egyptian royalty that it could reduce a pharaoh to a fragile invalid? And what does his suffering reveal about the high price of so-called purity? To understand the tragedy of Tutankhamun's body, you must first understand the system that created him. It is a system rooted in a concept that feels alien to the modern mind, the divinity of the king. The pharaoh was not merely a ruler appointed by the gods. He was a god himself, a Horus on earth, destined to become an Osiris in the afterlife. This belief was the bedrock of Egyptian society, the organizing principle for religion, politics, and power for over 3 millennia. Maintaining this divine status required a concept of purity, and the purest thing of all was the royal bloodline itself. To dilute it with the blood of commoners or even lesser nobility was seen as a contamination, a weakening of the divine essence. The gods themselves provided the ultimate template. In the foundational myths of their cosmology, the god Osiris married his sister Isis. Their union produced Horus, the rightful heir. If it was the way of the gods, then it must be the way of the god-kings on earth. This divine precedent sanctified a practice that modern science recognizes as a genetic catastrophe, systemic, generational incest. For centuries, pharaohs of the New Kingdom married their sisters, half-sisters, and sometimes even their own daughters, all in a desperate, obsessive attempt to keep the divine bloodline undiluted and the power of the throne uncontested. It was a closed loop, a genetic echo chamber where sacredness was preserved at the cost of biological viability. Tutankhamun was born at the absolute apex of this systemic dysfunction during one of the most chaotic periods in Egyptian history. His likely father was the pharaoh Akhenaten, a figure who remains one of history's most radical and controversial revolutionaries. Akhenaten shattered 3,000 years of religious tradition, casting aside the sprawling pantheon of Egyptian gods, Amun-Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus-and, decreeing that there was only one true god. The Aten, represented as the physical disk of the sun, he moved the capital from the ancient religious center of Thebes to a new, purpose-built city in the desert called Akhenaten, known today as Amarna. This was not just a religious reform, it was a violent cultural and political revolution that alienated the powerful and wealthy priesthood of Amun-Ra and destabilized the entire empire. In this strange, isolated world of sun worship, Akhenaten's family continued the tradition of incestuous marriage with a fanatical devotion. Genetic analysis of the royal mummies from this period has confirmed what was long suspected. Tutankhamun's parents were almost certainly brother and sister. The mummy known as the Younger Lady, found in tomb KV35, has been identified as both the daughter of Amenhotep III and Queen Tiye, and as Tutankhamun's mother. This makes her the full sister of Akhenaten, her husband, and Tutankhamun's father. The boy was therefore not just the product of a single incestuous union, but likely the culmination of multiple generations of inbreeding, a genetic dead end for the glorious 18th dynasty. He inherited a kingdom in turmoil and a body riddled with congenital defects. When Akhenaten died, the throne passed to the young boy, then known as Tutankhamun, living image of the Aten. He was perhaps only 9 years old. A child king is always a pawn, and Tutankhamun was no exception. He was surrounded by powerful, older advisors, most notably the Vizier I and the General Horemheb, men who had served his father but who saw the catastrophic failure of his religious experiment. They orchestrated a complete reversal of Akhenaten's revolution. The boy king's name was changed to Tutankhamun, signaling the restoration of the old god Amun. The court abandoned the desert city of Akhenaten and returned to Thebes. The temples of the old gods were reopened and restored, their priests reinstated with all their former power and wealth. On victory stales and temple walls, the official narrative was one of glorious restoration, of a wise young king setting the world right after a period of darkness and heresy. But behind the towering statues and propagandistic inscriptions was the daily, grinding reality of Tutankhamun's physical suffering. His tomb provides the most intimate and damning evidence. Amongst the golden chariots and breathtaking treasures, archaeologists led by Howard Carter in 1922 found something far more personal and pathetic: a collection of over 130 walking canes and staves. These were not merely symbolic staffs of office. Forensic analysis showed that many of them were heavily used, their tips worn down from constant contact with the ground. He literally could not walk unaided. Modern CT scans and DNA analysis of his mummy have painted a gruesome, detailed portrait of his afflictions. His left foot was severely deformed, a condition known as talipes equinovarus, or clubfoot. The bones of his foot were twisted inwards at a sharp angle, making it impossible for him to place it flat on the ground. He would have walked on the side of his foot or his ankle, a posture that would have been excruciatingly painful and would have thrown his entire gait off balance, putting constant strain on his hips and spine. Compounding this was evidence of Kohler's disease, a rare and painful bone disorder where the navicular bone in the foot temporarily loses its blood supply, leading to tissue death or a vascular necrosis. The bone essentially dies and collapses before slowly reforming. It is a condition that causes intense pain and swelling, making it even more difficult to bear weight. The pain in his foot was not a minor inconvenience. It was a constant, dominating feature of his existence, a fire that never went out. This is why the afterlife provisions in his tomb included not just ceremonial chariots, but also those hundreds of walking sticks the gods, it was hoped, would grant him in death the mobility he never had in life. The deformities were not confined to his feet. Scans of his skull revealed a partially cleft palate, a hole in the roof of his mouth that would have connected his oral and nasal cavities. This would have given his voice a nasal, indistinct quality, robbing the speeches of the living God of their divine authority. Eating and drinking would have been a challenge, with food and liquid often passing into his nasal passages, leading to choking and potential infections. He also had a slight curvature of the spine, or scoliosis, and the overbite characteristic of his family, the so-called Habsburg jaw of the Thutmosid dynasty, another telltale sign of generations of inbreeding. His very body was a medical textbook of recessive genetic disorders, brought to the fore by his parents' catastrophic union. Every flawed gene, every hidden weakness that might have remained dormant in a more diverse gene pool, was given purchase in the body of the boy king. His immune system, compromised from birth, was a fragile shield against the diseases of the ancient world, and in the Nile Valley, one disease reigned supreme: malaria. DNA testing of his mummy revealed the presence of genetic material from Plasmodium falciparum, the deadliest malaria parasite. Not just one strain, but multiple strains, indicating that he had suffered from repeated, severe bouts of the disease throughout his short life. For a healthy person, malaria is a brutal ordeal of high fevers, bone-shaking chills, and crippling weakness. For a boy with a clubfoot, a dying bone, a cleft palate, and a compromised immune system, it must have been a recurring nightmare, each bout pushing his fragile body closer to the breaking point. His life was not one of golden splendor, but one of chronic, unrelenting pain. Imagine the daily reality. Waking in the morning, the first sensation is the familiar, deep ache in your left foot. To stand is an act of will, requiring you to reach for one of the many finely carved canes that are your constant companions. You are dressed by servants in the linen kilt and golden pectorals of a pharaoh, but the divine regalia feels like a costume on a broken frame. You preside over court, your words slightly slurred by the defect in your mouth, trying to project an aura of command while leaning heavily on your staff. Perhaps there is a ceremony, a public appearance where you must be seen. You might be carried in a sedilia chair, or perhaps you ride in a chariot, not as a mighty warrior, but as a passenger, the reins held by another. The reliefs carved on temple walls show you as a triumphant archer, a conqueror crushing Egypt's enemies beneath your chariot wheels. But you know the truth. You have likely never stood unsupported in a moving chariot in your life. The art is a lie, a carefully constructed fantasy of power designed to conceal the grotesque reality of your weakness. Every moment of his reign, every religious edict and political decision was made against a backdrop of this physical agony. The great project of restoring the old gods was overseen by a boy whose own body seemed to be a punishment from them. His entire existence was a paradox, a vessel of divine power who was physically weaker than almost any of his subjects, a lord of the two lands who could barely walk across a room. The climax of Tutankhamun's life was not a great battle or a monumental construction project, but his own pathetic and agonizing death at the age of just 19. For years, the prevailing theory was that he was murdered, perhaps by a blow to the back of the head, a victim of the political ambitions of his advisors, Ai or Horemheb. It was a romantic and dramatic theory, but modern science has revealed a far more mundane and yet somehow more horrific truth. The damage to his skull was almost certainly inflicted after his death, during the bungled mummification process, or by Carter's team in the 20th century. The real cause of death was hidden in the bones of his leg. CT scans taken in 2005 revealed a severe, unhealed fracture to his left femur, the thigh bone, just above the knee. It was not a simple, clean break. It was a comminuted, compound fracture, meaning the bone was shattered and fragments had pierced the skin, creating a large, open wound. We can never know for certain how it happened. Perhaps he fell, his weak, unbalanced body finally betraying him. Perhaps he was in a chariot that overturned. Regardless of the cause, the result was catastrophic. Let us slow down time and witness his final days. Picture the scene. The young king lies on a royal bed, his leg grotesquely swollen and discolored. The pain is a white-hot, blinding agony that eclipses everything else. There are no painkillers, no morphine, only perhaps draughts of wine or opium-laced concoctions that barely touch the edges of his torment. Priests chant incantations to Sekhmet, the goddess of healing, but the wound is beyond their magic. Physicians apply poultices of honey and herbs, but they are powerless against the enemy that is now gathering its forces. With the skin broken, the warm, wet environment of the deep wound becomes a perfect breeding ground for bacteria. An infection begins to brew, a fulminating, unstoppable sepsis. The area around the wound becomes hot, red, and puffy. A foul-smelling pus begins to seep from the torn flesh. A fever takes hold, first a slight chill, then a raging fire that consumes his body. He is thrown into violent shivers that rack his already broken frame, each spasm sending a fresh wave of excruciating pain from his shattered leg. This is the moment his other great nemesis, malaria, makes its final, fatal appearance. A body under extreme physical stress from trauma and infection is the perfect target for a malarial relapse. The parasites, always lying dormant in his liver and blood, sense his weakness and explode into a full-blown attack. The fever spikes even higher. He becomes delirious, his mind lost in a terrifying landscape of nightmares and hallucinations. The living god, the Lord of Diadems, is reduced to a moaning, thrashing creature, barely conscious of the anxious faces of his wife, Akhenaten, or his advisors hovering around him. The sickly sweet smell of decay, of dying flesh, begins to fill the royal chamber, a smell that even the heavy incense cannot completely mask. His body, already a war zone of genetic defects, is now fighting a battle on two fronts: a massive bacterial infection in his leg and a parasitic invasion of his blood. It is a battle it cannot win. His breathing becomes shallow and ragged. His heart struggles to pump the poisoned blood through his veins. Within days, perhaps only hours, of the initial injury, the system collapses. The god king Tutankhamun, the Golden Horus, dies not from an assassin's blade or in a glorious battle, but from a cascade of systemic failure, drowning in a tide of infection and disease unleashed by a simple broken bone. It was a squalid, painful, and deeply ignominious end. The death of a pharaoh was meant to trigger a sacred and meticulous 70-day process of mummification, a complex ritual designed to transform the mortal body into an eternal vessel for the soul. But Tutankhamun's death was sudden and unexpected, and his burial bears all the hallmarks of a rushed and botched job. The embalmers, who were masters of their craft, seemed to have made a series of bizarre and uncharacteristic errors. The incision made in his side to remove the internal organs was rougher and larger than usual. His heart, which was almost always left inside the body as the seat of intelligence and conscience, was removed. Most strangely of all, they poured an enormous quantity of black, resinous liquida mixture of oils and coniferous resinol over his wrapped body and inside his solid gold coffin. Over the centuries, this unguent underwent a chemical reaction, a slow, spontaneous combustion that effectively cooked the king's remains. Temperatures inside the coffin may have exceeded 200 degrees Celsius, charring the skin and making the linen wrappings brittle. This resin also acted as a powerful glue, cementing the mummy to the base of the golden coffin and the golden mask to his face. This created a horrific dilemma for Howard Carter and his team when they finally opened the sarcophagus in 1924. They were confronted with a solid mass. The body of the king was irrevocably bonded to his priceless coffin. In their desperate attempts to free the treasures for study and display, they committed a final, brutal indignity upon the boy king's body. Using heated knives and chisels, they systematically dismembered his corpse. They wrenched the head and neck from the torso to remove the golden mask. They cut the body in half at the torso. They severed the arms and legs. They pried loose individual ribs. The fragile, broken body of the boy who had suffered so much in life was subjected to one last, grotesque violation in death, broken into 18 separate pieces by the very men who had rediscovered him. His remains, which the ancient Egyptians had so desperately tried to preserve for eternity, were ultimately shattered by the combination of a rushed embalming and modern archaeological zeal. The body of the god was butchered, a collection of charred bones and brittle tissues to be catalogued and stored in a box. The legacy of Tutankhamun is a story of profound historical irony. His physical weakness and his death at 19 without a living heir plunged the dynasty into a succession crisis. He had been married to his half-sister, Akhenaten, and though they had tried to produce an heir, the only evidence we have of their children are the two tiny, mummified fetuses found buried in his tomb. Two daughters, one stillborn at about 5 months gestation, the other at around 9 months. They too were victims of the same genetic curse, unable to survive even in the womb. With no direct heir, the throne was seized by the old vizier, who married Tutankhamun's young widow to legitimize his claim. When died after a short reign, power was seized by the general Horemheb. These men, the new pharaohs, had a vested interest in burying the past. They initiated a campaign of damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory, against the entire Amarna period. They sought to erase Akhenaten, the heretic, and his immediate successors, including Tutankhamun, from the historical record. Their names were systematically chiseled off king lists and monuments. Their temples were dismantled, their statues smashed. It was a thorough and vicious attempt at historical annihilation. This act of post-mortem violence is precisely what saved him. Because Tutankhamun's reign was officially forgotten, the location of his small, insignificant tomb in the Valley of the Kings was lost to memory. The great, powerful pharaohs of the next dynasty, like Ramesses the Great, built their own massive tombs nearby, and the debris from their construction work piled up over the entrance to Tutankhamun's resting place, hiding it from view. For over 3,000 years, while the grand tombs of more famous kings were looted and emptied by ancient and modern tomb robbers, the boy king's tomb lay untouched, a perfect time capsule of royal funerary splendor. The very men who tried to erase him from history inadvertently became his ultimate preservers. The systemic flaw of dynastic inbreeding that destroyed his body and ended his line created the political chaos that ultimately led to his historical erasure, which in turn protected his tomb, allowing his story and the scientific evidence of his suffering to be revealed to the modern world. His body, in the end, became his most enduring monumenta testament not to divine perfection, but to the devastating biological consequences of a flawed ideology. He became a symbol, not of royal power, but of systemic fragility. So we return to the image of the golden mask, that icon of serene and timeless majesty. It is perhaps the most famous lie in all of history. We are captivated by the treasure, by the glittering gold and lapis lazuli, because it represents the world as the Egyptians wanted it to be, orderly, divine, eternal, and perfect. But the truth of Tutankhamun lies not in the mask, but in the broken bones beneath it. His story is a chilling, cautionary tale that transcends ancient Egypt. It is a story about the danger of any ideology that values abstract purity, whether it is the purity of a bloodline, a race, a religion, or a political doctrine over the messy, imperfect reality of human life. When a system becomes a closed loop, when it refuses to adapt or to admit outside influence, it begins to decay from within. It produces its own pathologies, its own weaknesses, which are then passed down from one generation to the next, escalating until the entire structure collapses. We may no longer practice royal incest to preserve a divine mandate, but our own world is filled with dangerous ideologies of purity. We see it in the hateful rhetoric of racial supremacy, in the rigid dogma of religious fundamentalism, and in the sterile echo chambers of online political discourse, where any dissenting view is treated as a contamination to be purged. We create systems, both social and intellectual, that reward conformity and punish difference, slowly but surely concentrating our own forms of weakness. The story of Tutankhamun is not just about a tragic boy with a clubfoot who lived over 3,000 years ago. It is a biopsy of a civilization, revealing the fatal disease at its heart. His fragile, pain-racked body, preserved by a fluke of history, serves as a permanent, chilling warning. It reminds us that any system, no matter how golden or glorious it appears on the surface, is doomed to fail when its obsession with an imagined perfection leads it to sacrifice the very people it is supposed to serve.